The courtroom was silent. The air was thick with tension as Officer Greg Lawson stood tall, his badge gleaming under the bright courtroom lights. His voice was steady, confident, too confident. I saw the defendant, Mr. Jonathan Cole, resisting arrest. He was aggressive, uncooperative, and posed a clear threat to public safety. He even tried to reach for my weapon. The officer said, staring straight ahead, lying without a single hesitation. Jonathan sat at the defendant's table, calm but unreadable. He listened as the officer twisted the truth into a false story, painting him as a violent criminal. The jury watched Officer Lawson with stern expressions, soaking up every word. The judge nodded, considering the testimony. "And you're sure, Officer Lawson?" "Yes, Your Honor," the officer replied. I feared for my life. Jonathan inhaled deeply. He could feel the weight of the lie pressing down on him. He wasn't just any man sitting in that chair. He was a high-ranking Navy SEAL, trained to protect his country, to uphold justice, and to stand against corruption. But this officer had no idea who he was lying about. Jonathan folded his hands together and slowly looked up. His sharp blue eyes locked onto the officer's. His voice, when he spoke, was calm but chilling. "Are you sure about that, officer?" Jonathan's voice echoed across the courtroom. The officer hesitated for the first time. Jonathan leaned forward. "Because I have something that proves you're lying." The courtroom gasped. The officer's face turned pale. The judge narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean, Mr. Cole?" the judge asked, leaning forward with interest. Jonathan's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Let's just say, the truth is about to come out." The officer's breath hitched. Then, bang, the courtroom doors burst open. A man in a dark suit rushed in, carrying a file. Jonathan's lawyer stood up instantly. "Your Honor, we have new evidence that will change everything." Gasps filled the courtroom again. The officer's confident posture wavered. Sweat appeared on his brow. Jonathan didn't take his eyes off him. He knew this was just the beginning. 2 weeks earlier, the sun had just begun to set over San Diego, painting the sky with orange and purple streaks. Jonathan Cole sat at an outdoor cafe, enjoying a peaceful evening. It had been a long week, and he was finally allowing himself a break. He took a sip of his coffee, listening to the quiet hum of the city. That was when he heard it. A voice. Shaky. Frightened. "Please, sir. I didn't mean to." Jonathan turned his head slightly. Down the street, near a parking lot, a young teenager stood with his hands raised. A police officer, Officer Greg Lawson, had him cornered against a wall. The boy, no older than 16, looked terrified. He wore a hoodie and had a backpack slung over his shoulder. He didn't appear dangerous, just scared. Officer Lawson towered over him. "I saw you trying to break into that car," he growled. No, I wasn't. I was just looking for my phone. I dropped it near there, I swear." The officer scoffed. "Yeah? Then why do you look so nervous?" The boy gulped. I just..." Jonathan watched closely. Something felt off. He had seen enough men in combat to recognize when someone was lying, and the kid wasn't. But the officer? His stance, his aggressive tone, the way his hand rested on his holster. Jonathan had seen this type before. A bully with a badge. Jonathan stood up. He wasn't the kind of man who could just sit and watch. He walked over, his movements calm but deliberate. "Evening, officer." Officer Lawson turned. He scanned Jonathan quickly, not recognizing him. "Move along, sir. Police business." Jonathan smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I understand. But I couldn't help overhearing. What's going on here?" "This kid was caught trying to break into a car," the officer said. "I wasn't," the boy cried. "I was looking for my..." "Quiet," Lawson snapped. Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Did you see him trying to break in?" "I saw him near the car," the officer said defensively. "But did you see him inside it? Touching it?" Lawson glared at Jonathan. "Sir, I don't know who you think you are, but this doesn't concern you." Jonathan folded his arms. "Actually, it does. Because I saw the whole thing from my seat over there." The officer stiffened. "I saw the boy drop something near the car and start looking for it. Never once did he touch the door handle, the window, or anything else. So I'd be careful about making false accusations." The boy looked at Jonathan in awe, as if he couldn't believe someone was standing up for him. Lawson's eyes darkened. "I don't need some civilian telling me how to do my job." Jonathan's face remained unreadable. "You're right. But I know the law. And I know that intimidation isn't part of it." Lawson clenched his jaw. He looked like he wanted to argue, but he knew he had no proof against the boy. Finally, he huffed. Fine. Get out of here, kid. But next time, you won't be so lucky. The boy nodded quickly and ran off. Jonathan didn't move. He kept his eyes on the officer. That was the right choice. Officer Lawson scoffed. I don't care what you think. He turned and stormed off, shoving past Jonathan's shoulder as he walked away. Jonathan sighed. He hadn't come looking for trouble, but trouble had a way of finding him. Little did he know, this wasn't over. 2 nights later, he was walking home from the gym when flashing red and blue lights filled the street. Jonathan Cole. Hands where I can see them. He turned. Officer Lawson stood there with 2 other officers, all with their hands on their guns. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. What is this? You're under arrest, Lawson said with a smug grin. For resisting an officer. Jonathan's fists clenched. He had done no such thing. He had seen this move before. Lawson was getting revenge. Jonathan exhaled slowly, raising his hands. This is a mistake. No mistake, Lawson sneered. The metal cuffs snapped onto Jonathan's wrists. And just like that, a Navy SEAL, one of the most highly trained men in the world, was taken into custody for a crime he did not commit. But Lawson had made one big mistake. He had no idea who he was messing with. Now, sitting in the courtroom, Jonathan remained calm. He knew the truth. He knew what was about to happen next. The officer just didn't know it yet. Then, bang, the new evidence was about to change everything. The courtroom fell into chaos. Whispers and gasps filled the air as the man in the dark suit strode toward the judge's bench, gripping a thick folder. His expression was unreadable, but his urgency was clear. Officer Lawson's face turned pale. He shifted nervously as Jonathan leaned back in his chair, watching him like a predator studying its prey. The judge banged his gavel. Order in the court. Who are you, and what is this evidence? The man cleared his throat. Your Honor, my name is Andrew Carter, and I am with the Department of Naval Investigations. I have in my possession video footage that directly contradicts Officer Lawson's testimony. A ripple of shock ran through the courtroom. Jonathan remained still, but inside, he felt a deep satisfaction. Now, the real fight was about to begin. The judge adjusted his glasses. Video footage? Yes, Your Honor. Carter opened the file and pulled out a flash drive. This footage was recovered from a nearby surveillance camera. It shows what really happened the night Jonathan Cole was arrested. Lawson's eyes darted around the room. His confidence was slipping. His hands twitched as if he wanted to snatch the evidence away. The judge waved at the bailiff. Play the footage. A large screen was rolled in. The courtroom fell silent as the video began. The screen flickered to life, showing a grainy but clear nighttime recording of the street where Jonathan had been arrested. The footage showed Jonathan walking home, minding his own business. Then, flashing lights appeared. Officer Lawson stepped out of his patrol car. The audio was crisp. Jonathan Cole. Hands where I can see them. What is this? Jonathan's voice was calm. You're under arrest, Lawson sneered. For resisting an officer. Then came the worst part. Lawson suddenly lunged forward, grabbing Jonathan's arm, yanking him violently. Jonathan did not resist, but Lawson threw him to the ground anyway. The officer smirked at his fellow officers, who watched without interfering. The video ended. Silence. Then, lies, Lawson blurted out. His face was red with panic. This video is doctored. This is a setup. The judge narrowed his eyes. Officer Lawson, are you saying the footage is fake? Yes. Lawson's voice cracked. He was losing control. Jonathan finally spoke. His voice was calm, steady. Doctored? Interesting. Because that camera belongs to the city's traffic department. It records 24/7. You saying the city is framing you too? Lawson's mouth opened, but no words came out. The prosecutor stood. Your Honor, in light of this evidence, we request that all charges against Mr. Cole be dropped immediately. The judge nodded. Agreed. The charges are hereby dismissed. He turned to Lawson. And as for you, Officer Lawson, you are hereby placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. A murmur spread through the crowd. Lawson's world crumbled before him. Jonathan stood, the weight of injustice lifting off his shoulders. He turned to Lawson and whispered just loud enough for him to hear. You picked the wrong man to lie about. Lawson's hands balled into fists, but he couldn't do anything. Not anymore. As Jonathan walked out of the courtroom, he felt the sun on his face again. He was free, but he knew this wasn't over. Officer Lawson wasn't done with him, and Jonathan wasn't done with Lawson. 3 days earlier, Jonathan stared at the ceiling of his small holding cell. He had been in worse places, hostile enemy camps, deep-sea covert missions, life-or-death situations, but never had he been locked up in his own country for something he didn't do. He heard footsteps approaching. The metal door slid open, and a man in a sharp black suit stepped in. He had short gray hair and a hardened face. "Mr. Cole." Jonathan sat up. "Who's asking?" The man smirked. "Andrew Carter, Department of Naval Investigations." Jonathan narrowed his eyes. "Naval Investigations?" Carter nodded. Word travels fast when a Navy SEAL gets arrested for a crime he didn't commit. He leaned against the wall. "The question is, why?" Jonathan sighed. "Because I stood up to a bully." Carter chuckled. "Sounds about right." He pulled out a small device from his pocket and pressed a button. It beeped. "All right, we're secure. No one can listen in." Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "What's this about?" Carter's expression darkened. "This isn't just about you, Cole. Officer Lawson has a history. You're not the first person he's done this to." Jonathan's jaw clenched. "How many?" Carter exhaled. "At least 6. Maybe more. But no one has been able to prove it. Until now." Jonathan's eyes burned with anger. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for all the others Lawson had wronged. Carter continued. "We have enough evidence to take him down, but we need to be smart about this. That's why I'm here. We're getting you out." Jonathan smirked. "Good." Carter's eyes locked onto his. "And when we do, we take Lawson down together." Now, standing outside the courthouse, Jonathan took a deep breath. He was free, but he wasn't done. He turned to Carter. "What's next?" Carter smiled. "We make sure Lawson never wears a badge again." Jonathan nodded. This fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The cold night air swept across the city as Jonathan stood on the courthouse steps, watching Officer Lawson storm out the back entrance. His face was twisted in barely contained rage, his fists clenched at his sides. Jonathan had seen that look before, on the faces of men who realized their power was slipping away. Lawson turned, locking eyes with him. "You think this is over?" he spat. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Jonathan tilted his head, his expression calm. "You made yours first." Lawson's nostrils flared, but he knew better than to start a fight here. With a sharp breath, he turned and disappeared into the darkness. Carter stepped up beside Jonathan. "That man isn't walking away quietly." "I know," Jonathan said. "And I wouldn't want him to." Carter smirked. "Come on. Let's talk somewhere more private." The two men walked through the quiet city streets until they reached a small cafe. It was nearly empty, save for an old man in the corner reading a newspaper and a waitress wiping down the counter. They took a booth near the back. Carter ordered a coffee. Jonathan didn't touch the menu. Carter leaned forward. "We have an opportunity here, Cole. Lawson is already under investigation, but he's just a symptom of a bigger disease." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Go on." Carter slid a file across the table. Jonathan flipped it open. Inside were photos of other officers, some smiling in uniform, others in grainy security footage, shaking hands with men in dark suits. "These officers," Carter said, tapping on one of the photos, "are connected to Lawson. He's not just a bad cop. He's part of a network." Jonathan's stomach churned. He had seen corruption before, overseas, in war zones, in broken governments. But seeing it here, in his own country, hit differently. "How deep does this go?" Carter sighed. "Deeper than we thought." Lawson wasn't just picking on random people. He was protecting something. Or someone. Jonathan's mind was already working through the possibilities. So taking him down isn't enough. "No," Carter confirmed. "But he's the key." Jonathan closed the file and looked out the window. The city lights reflected in his sharp blue eyes. "Then we make him talk." Carter smirked. "I was hoping you'd say that." The next night, Jonathan waited outside a bar on the east side of the city. It was a well-known cop hangout, a place where off-duty officers gathered to drink, complain, and, in some cases, make dirty deals. He leaned against his motorcycle, dressed in dark jeans and a leather jacket, blending into the shadows. At exactly 11:17 p.m., Officer Lawson stumbled out of the bar, his face flushed with alcohol. He was alone. Jonathan waited until Lawson turned down a quieter street, then followed. Lawson muttered to himself, kicking at a loose can on the sidewalk. Then, as if sensing something, he stopped. Slowly, he turned. Jonathan stepped into the dim light of a flickering street lamp. Lawson sneered. "What do you want, Cole?" Jonathan took a step forward, his voice calm but firm. "Answers." Lawson scoffed. "You think I'm just going to tell you what you want?" He chuckled, but there was unease in his eyes. "You got lucky in court. That's all." Jonathan smirked. "You really believe that?" Lawson opened his mouth to fire back, but in a blur of movement, Jonathan was in front of him. He grabbed Lawson by the collar and slammed him against the brick wall. The officer gasped, his hands instinctively reaching for his gun. But Jonathan was faster. He disarmed him in one swift motion, tucking the weapon into his own waistband. Lawson's eyes widened. Jonathan leaned in, his voice a low growl. "You're going to tell me who you work for? Who's protecting you?" Lawson spat at the ground. "I don't have to tell you anything." Jonathan sighed. "You know, I've interrogated men a lot tougher than you. Men who would rather die than talk." He tilted his head. "Do you know what I learned?" Lawson swallowed hard. Jonathan smirked. "Everyone breaks." Lawson tried to keep up his tough act, but Jonathan saw the cracks forming. The officer wasn't used to being the one backed into a corner. Jonathan let go of his collar and took a step back. "You have two choices. You tell me what I need to know, or I find out myself. And trust me, if I do it my way, it won't be pleasant for you." Lawson wiped his mouth, glaring. "You think you scare me?" Jonathan simply stared at him. Seconds stretched into silence. Then, Lawson's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his face paling. Jonathan snatched it from his hand before he could react. He glanced at the screen. The message read, "He knows too much. Take care of it. Now." Jonathan's heart pounded. Whoever Lawson was working for was watching, and they had just given him an order. Lawson lunged for the phone, but Jonathan sidestepped easily, flipping him around and pinning him against the wall again. "Who sent this?" Jonathan demanded. Lawson's breathing was ragged. I don't know." Jonathan applied just a little more pressure. "Wrong answer." Lawson winced. Okay. They call him the broker. No one knows his real name." Jonathan's mind raced. "And what does he want?" Lawson hesitated. Then, in a whisper, he said, "Control. Of everything." Jonathan's eyes narrowed. "And what does that mean for me?" Lawson hesitated again, then looked up with something close to pity in his eyes. "You were never supposed to walk out of that courthouse." Jonathan's stomach turned cold. Then, a gunshot rang out. The brick wall beside Jonathan's head exploded in dust. Someone was trying to kill him. Before he could react, Lawson shoved him backward and bolted down the alley. Jonathan turned just in time to see a dark figure on a rooftop, pulling the trigger again. Another shot. Jonathan dove for cover as the bullet missed him by inches. He rolled, grabbed Lawson's gun from his waistband, and fired back. But the shooter was already gone. Jonathan's heart pounded as he pushed himself up, scanning the rooftops. The night was silent again, but the message was clear. They wanted him dead. He exhaled, gripping the stolen phone in his hand. He had his next lead. Now it was time to hunt. Jonathan crouched behind a dumpster, his breath steady despite the adrenaline pumping through his veins. The rooftop shooter was gone, but the danger wasn't. Whoever had sent that message to Lawson wasn't playing games. They wanted him silenced. But Jonathan Cole wasn't the kind of man who went down easy. He checked the stolen phone again. The message was still on the screen. "He knows too much. Take care of it." Now, Lawson had vanished into the night, but that didn't matter. Jonathan had what he needed. A name. The broker. He didn't know who this person was, but if they were powerful enough to control dirty cops and hire assassins, they were a threat. And Jonathan didn't let threats go unanswered. He pulled out his own phone and dialed Carter. The agent picked up on the first ring. "What happened?" Carter asked. "I just got shot at," Jonathan said bluntly. A pause. Then, "Where are you?" Jonathan gave him the location. "Stay put," Carter said. "I'm on my way." Jonathan hung up and scanned the area. The street was eerily quiet now. Too quiet. He stayed alert, his instincts telling him something wasn't right. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Soft, calculated. Someone was nearby. Jonathan gripped the gun he had taken from Lawson and moved carefully along the alley. He peeked around the corner. A shadow moved. Jonathan spun, aiming the gun. "Whoa, whoa," a voice whispered. A woman stood in the dim light, her hands up. She was dressed in dark clothing, her hood pulled over her head. Jonathan narrowed his eyes. "Who are you?" The woman glanced around, then stepped closer. Her green eyes locked onto his. I'm someone who wants Lawson taken down just as much as you do, she said. Jonathan kept the gun raised. You've got 10 seconds to explain before I assume you're another shooter. She exhaled. My name is Riley Brooks. I'm a journalist. And if you want to know who the broker really is, you're going to need me. Jonathan didn't lower the gun. You have 5 seconds left. Riley's jaw clenched. I've been investigating corruption in the police force for years. Lawson is just a pawn. I was at the bar tonight because I was following him. I saw you confront him. And I saw the shooter. Jonathan studied her, trying to gauge if she was telling the truth. And I know where they're hiding, Riley said. Jonathan finally lowered the gun. Where? She hesitated. Not here. Too exposed. Just then, headlights flashed down the street. A black SUV. Jonathan's instincts screamed. Run. Without hesitation, Riley turned and sprinted with him down the alley as the SUV screeched to a stop. The doors flew open. 3 men jumped out, all armed. Gunfire erupted. Jonathan pushed Riley behind cover and fired back. He hit the first man in the shoulder, sending him crashing against the hood of the car. The second man fired wildly, bullets pinging off the metal dumpster. Jonathan ducked, reloading quickly. Got a gun? He asked Riley. She smirked and pulled a small pistol from her jacket. What kind of journalist do you think I am? Jonathan almost laughed. Almost. They fired in unison. Riley hit the second man in the leg, dropping him. Jonathan took out the last shooter with a clean shot to the arm. The SUV's tires screeched as the driver sped away, leaving his men behind. Silence filled the alley. Jonathan scanned the area. The attackers were down but alive. That meant answers. He grabbed one of the injured men and hauled him up against the wall. Who sent you? The man groaned, blood dripping from his shoulder. Go to hell. Jonathan leaned in. Already been there. You won't like it. The man spat at the ground, his breathing heavy. You don't get it, do you? He muttered. You're already dead. Jonathan's grip tightened. Who is the broker? The man grinned through his pain. You'll find out soon enough. Jonathan stared at him, then knocked him out cold with a quick punch. Riley crossed her arms. Well, that was dramatic. Jonathan ignored her and picked up one of the fallen men's phones. He scrolled through the messages until he found something useful. A location. An abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. He showed it to Riley. You said you know where they hide. She nodded. That's one of their spots. But it's heavily guarded. Jonathan smirked. Not for long. Before Riley could argue, headlights flashed again. But this time, it was Carter. The black sedan screeched to a stop, and Carter stepped out, looking at the scene with a raised brow. You couldn't even wait for me, could you? He sighed. Jonathan shrugged. Had a busy night. Carter looked at Riley. And you are? Riley Brooks, she said. The only person in this city who knows how deep this goes. Carter sighed. Great. Another wild card. Jonathan pocketed the phone. We have a location. We move now. Carter frowned. Are you insane? That place will be crawling with Lawson's guys. Jonathan's eyes darkened. Then we take them all out. Riley crossed her arms. I like this guy. Carter groaned. I hate this plan already. Jonathan smirked. Then you'll love what happens next. As the team climbed into the car and sped off toward the warehouse, Jonathan knew one thing for sure. Tonight, someone was going to answer for everything. The warehouse loomed ahead like a sleeping beast, its rusted exterior barely lit by the flickering streetlights. It sat on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by chain-link fences topped with barbed wire. The only signs of life were the occasional silhouettes moving inside and the glow of a cigarette as one of the guards stood near the entrance. Inside that building, Jonathan knew, were the answers he needed. The car rolled to a stop a block away. Carter cut the engine, turning to Jonathan and Riley. All right, before we go in there like a wrecking ball, let's think this through. Jonathan smirked. Thinking is what got me here. Action is what's going to get us answers. Carter rubbed his temples. You really are a SEAL. Riley leaned forward. He's right. We don't have time to wait. If the broker knows we survived that attack, they'll be moving everything soon. Carter exhaled sharply. Fine, but we need a plan. Jonathan already had one. There are 3 guards outside. 1 smoking, 2 watching the gate, he said. If we go in loud, they'll alert everyone inside. Riley tapped her chin. Then we go in quiet. Jonathan nodded. I'll take out the guard at the gate. Carter, you get the one near the fence. Riley, you cover us. Carter grumbled. I don't like taking orders, but fine. Jonathan pulled his knife from its sheath, the blade gleaming under the moonlight. Let's move. They slipped into the shadows, creeping toward the fence. The wind howled softly, masking their footsteps. Jonathan reached the first guard in seconds. The man barely had time to react before Jonathan wrapped an arm around his throat, pulling him into the darkness. A brief struggle, then silence. Carter took care of the second, dragging him behind a pile of crates. Riley aimed her gun at the third, but Jonathan motioned for her to hold. He approached the last man, the one with the cigarette. The guard exhaled a puff of smoke, watching the night sky. He never saw Jonathan coming. In one smooth motion, Jonathan grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it. The cigarette dropped, and before the guard could shout, Jonathan struck him hard across the temple. He crumpled like a sack of bricks. Riley exhaled. Remind me never to fight you. Jonathan smirked. Noted. Carter glanced at the now unguarded warehouse entrance. All right, now for the hard part. Jonathan led the way inside, moving through the dimly lit corridors like a ghost. The air smelled of oil and rust, and the floor creaked under their weight. They reached a large room filled with crates and scattered papers. Maps, photos, weapons, all signs of an organized operation. This isn't just a hideout, Carter whispered. This is a command center. Jonathan's eyes locked onto a table in the middle of the room. A laptop sat open, its screen filled with encrypted messages. But one name stood out. Cole. Jonathan stiffened. He stepped closer, scrolling through the messages. One read. Eliminate Cole before he gets any closer. Another. He's too dangerous. Make it look like an accident. Carter peered over his shoulder. Someone really wants you dead. Jonathan clenched his fists. Yeah, and I want to know why. Riley scanned the room. If we can take this laptop, we can. She never finished the sentence. Because at that moment, an alarm blared. Red lights flashed as doors slammed shut. A voice crackled over an intercom. Well. I was wondering when you'd show up. Jonathan's blood ran cold. The voice was smooth, confident. The broker. Mr. Cole, the voice continued. You've been causing quite the mess. I'm impressed. But this game is over. Carter cursed under his breath. They knew we were coming. Jonathan's eyes darted around the room, searching for an exit. But before he could move, the floor beneath them exploded. A deafening blast shook the entire building, sending crates and debris flying. Jonathan was thrown backward, crashing into a metal shelf. Pain shot through his side, but he ignored it. Smoke filled the room. He coughed, struggling to his feet. Riley was on the ground, groaning, her leg pinned under a fallen beam. Carter was already firing at the figures moving through the smoke. Armed men poured in from every direction. Jonathan grabbed Riley, pulling her to safety behind a crate. Carter ducked behind another stack of boxes, reloading. We are so screwed. Jonathan gritted his teeth. Not yet. He grabbed his gun, took a deep breath, and stepped into the chaos. Bullets flew past his head. He fired back, dropping 2 attackers. Another charged at him with a knife. Jonathan disarmed him in seconds, slamming him into a wall. Riley, still limping, grabbed a gun from the ground and shot another attacker before he could flank them. Carter took down another with a well-placed shot. We need a way out of here. Jonathan's mind raced. The blast had weakened the walls. He spotted a support beam, barely holding up a section of the ceiling. Shoot that beam, he ordered. Carter hesitated. Are you crazy? Just do it. Carter aimed and fired. The beam snapped. The ceiling groaned, then collapsed, sending dust and debris crashing down. The attackers scrambled to escape the falling rubble. Jonathan grabbed Riley and pulled her toward a side door. Go. Now. They sprinted through the smoke-filled corridors, dodging falling debris. Finally, they burst out into the open night air. The warehouse groaned behind them. Then, with one final explosion, it collapsed. Flames roared into the sky as Jonathan, Riley, and Carter stood at a safe distance, catching their breath. Carter wiped soot from his face. That was insane. Jonathan didn't respond. He was already looking at the stolen laptop he had grabbed before escaping. Because on that screen, a single message had appeared. You got away this time, Mr. Cole. But I always win in the end. The broker. Jonathan's grip tightened. This wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The night air smelled of smoke and burning metal as the remains of the warehouse crackled behind them. Jonathan stood motionless, His eyes locked on the flickering laptop screen in his hands. You got away this time, Mr. Cole. But I always win in the end. The broker. Riley limped to his side, her face smeared with dirt. Well, that's not ominous at all. Carter let out a frustrated sigh, rubbing his temples. You know what? I'm officially done underestimating how bad this situation can get. Jonathan barely heard them. His mind was racing. The broker wasn't just some shadowy figure pulling strings from behind a desk. He was watching. He had known they were coming. And that meant one thing. They had a mole. Jonathan turned to Carter. We need to move. Now. Carter frowned. What? What? Jonathan showed him the message. He knew we were coming. Someone tipped him off. Riley's eyes widened. You think we've been compromised? Jonathan's jaw clenched. I don't think. I know. Carter groaned. This just keeps getting worse. Jonathan glanced back at the burning wreckage. We can't stay here. We need a secure location to dig into this laptop. Riley nodded. I know a place. They drove through the city in silence, tension thick in the air. Riley directed them to an old storage facility on the edge of town. It was abandoned, forgotten, exactly the kind of place they needed. Jonathan parked the car and helped Riley inside. Carter followed, gun in hand, scanning for any threats. Inside, the place was dusty but intact. Rows of storage units lined the walls, and in the back, an old office still had working electricity. Riley powered up the laptop while Jonathan and Carter stood watch. The screen flickered to life. Files, messages, encrypted data, it was all there. Jonathan pointed. Start with the messages. We need to know what Lawson was really doing. Riley's fingers flew across the keyboard. Give me a second, and she gasped. What? Jonathan asked. She turned the screen toward him. It was a list. A long, detailed list of names. Targets. Some names had been crossed out. Others were marked pending. Jonathan's stomach twisted as he scanned the list. Then he saw it. His own name. Jonathan Cole. High priority. He exhaled slowly. He had been on their radar for a long time. But the real shock came when he saw the name right beneath his. Andrew Carter, monitored. Jonathan's pulse quickened. He turned to Carter, who was staring at the screen, his face unreadable. Jonathan grabbed him by the shoulder. What aren't you telling me? Carter's expression darkened. Nothing. I swear I didn't know. Jonathan studied him. He wanted to believe him. But trust was running thin. Riley kept scrolling. Wait, there's something else. She pulled up an audio file. Jonathan leaned in. Play it. The speakers crackled. A deep voice filled the room. Officer Lawson, you're slipping. If Cole gets too close, he's your responsibility. If you fail, you know what happens next. A pause. Then Lawson's voice, desperate. I won't fail. I'll take care of it. The recording cut out. Jonathan clenched his fists. He was under orders. Carter crossed his arms. From the broker. Riley shook her head. This is bigger than we thought. Lawson was just one piece of it. There's a whole network of people keeping this operation running. Jonathan stared at the screen. He knew what had to be done. We find Lawson, he said, and we end this. 2 hours later. The city was quiet as Jonathan moved through the shadows. He had tracked Lawson's last known location to a rundown motel on the south side of town. He pressed his back against the wall, peeking through the broken blinds of room 17. Lawson was inside, pacing. He looked exhausted, paranoid. He had a gun in his hand, his fingers twitching. Jonathan glanced at Carter and Riley. Stay here. Carter raised an eyebrow. You're going in alone? Jonathan smirked. It's personal. Before Carter could argue, Jonathan slipped inside. The door creaked. Lawson spun, gun raised. But Jonathan was faster. In a heartbeat, he disarmed him, shoving him against the wall. Lawson gasped, struggling. See, Cole, listen. Jonathan pressed him harder. Start talking. Lawson's eyes darted around the room. I didn't have a choice. You don't know what he's capable of. Jonathan's grip tightened. Who is the broker? Lawson's breath hitched. He shook his head. No, if I tell you, I'm dead. Jonathan leaned in. You're dead either way. Lawson swallowed hard. Sweat dripped down his forehead. Then, in a whisper, he said, he's not just one man. Jonathan's blood ran cold. What do you mean? Lawson's voice was shaky. The broker. It's a code name. A system. A network of powerful people controlling everything from the shadows. Jonathan's stomach twisted. Who runs it? Lawson hesitated. Then, a single gunshot rang out. Jonathan instinctively ducked, but it wasn't aimed at him. Lawson gasped, his body jerking. A red stain spread across his chest. Jonathan spun just in time to see a dark figure disappearing into the night. Lawson collapsed, choking on his own breath. Jonathan caught him, lowering him to the floor. "Stay with me." Lawson's eyes fluttered. He struggled to speak. "Find the senator." Then his body went limp. Jonathan's fists clenched. Lawson was dead. And now he had a new lead. A senator. This fight wasn't over. It was just getting started. The sirens wailed in the distance, but Jonathan barely heard them. His mind was locked on Lawson's final words. "Find the senator." He clenched his jaw, staring down at Lawson's lifeless body. The dirty cop had made his choices, but in the end, he had feared something far worse than Jonathan. The broker wasn't just one person. It was an entire system, a network. And now, it led to a senator. Jonathan had spent his life taking down threats to his country. He had fought terrorists, warlords, and assassins. But corruption like this? This was different. This was wrought from within. Carter and Riley rushed inside. Carter cursed when he saw Lawson on the floor. "Well," Carter muttered, kneeling beside the body. "That's one less problem." Jonathan's gaze snapped to him. "No, it's one more." Carter raised an eyebrow. "You think Lawson was about to give us a name?" "He was scared," Jonathan said. "Whoever this senator is, they're high up in the broker's network." Riley stepped forward, her hands still gripping the stolen laptop. "Then we find them. We expose them." Jonathan exhaled. "No," he turned toward the door, eyes dark and unreadable. Riley frowned. "What do you mean, no?" Jonathan looked at her. "You expose criminals. I eliminate them." Carter groaned. "Oh, great. Here we go." Riley crossed her arms. "And how exactly do you plan on taking down a senator, Cole? You gonna storm into Washington, guns blazing?" Jonathan smirked. "If I have to." Carter sighed. "Look, I love a good action plan as much as the next guy, but let's be real here. You can't just go after a senator without proof. We need a name." Jonathan turned to Riley. "Can you get it?" She bit her lip, deep in thought. "Maybe. If we can decrypt Lawson's files before the broker wipes them." Carter ran a hand through his hair. "Then we'd better move. We're on borrowed time." Jonathan took one last look at Lawson before turning away. The man had been corrupt, but in his final moments, he had done something right. That didn't make him innocent, but it meant his death wouldn't be in vain. They had a new target, and Jonathan Cole wasn't going to stop until he found them. 1 hour later, Safe House. The small motel room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the laptop screen as Riley worked. Jonathan sat in the corner, deep in thought, while Carter paced. "Any luck?" Carter asked. Riley huffed. "You ever try hacking into a corrupted police server while knowing someone's actively trying to delete everything as you go?" Carter raised his hands. "I'll take that as a no." Jonathan leaned forward. "Can you do it?" Riley hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, but I need time." Jonathan exhaled. "Then we wait." Carter groaned. "I hate waiting." Jonathan ignored him. He was thinking about the senator, about what kind of power someone would need to be pulling these strings. If the broker had ties in the government, that meant this went far beyond dirty cops and backroom deals. This was something bigger. Riley suddenly gasped. "I got something." Jonathan and Carter rushed to her side. On the screen was a list of encrypted emails. Riley clicked one, and it opened. From unknown sender TO, Senator Mitchell Gray. Subject: Operations Report. Message: We have ensured that all loose ends are being handled. Cole is the last problem. Once eliminated, we move forward as planned. Jonathan's fists clenched. Carter cursed under his breath. "Well, there's your senator." Jonathan memorized the name. Mitchell Gray, a senior senator, a man with power, a man who wanted him dead. Jonathan leaned back, his expression unreadable. Carter eyed him warily. "I know that look." Jonathan stood. "Get me everything on him." Riley frowned. "And then what?" Jonathan grabbed his jacket. "Then I pay him a visit." Carter groaned. "You can't just walk into a senator's office and demand answers." Jonathan smirked. "Who said anything about asking?" Later that night, outside Senator Gray's estate, Jonathan crouched behind the bushes, scanning the perimeter of the massive estate. It was heavily guarded, armed men patrolling, security cameras covering every angle. This wasn't just a politician's house. This was a fortress. Carter's voice came through the earpiece. "This is a bad idea." Jonathan smirked. So was underestimating me. He moved like a shadow, slipping past the guards with practiced ease. Scaling the outer wall was simple. Avoiding the cameras was second nature. Within minutes, he was inside. The estate was quiet. Too quiet. Jonathan moved down the hallway, pressing himself against the walls. The entire place screamed wealth. Expensive paintings, marble floors, leather furniture. Then he saw it. A door, slightly ajar, with light spilling through the crack. Voices. Jonathan crept closer, listening. He survived the attack. A deep voice. Calm. Unshaken. A second voice. I don't understand how. Lawson was supposed to handle him. The first voice chuckled. Lawson was a pawn, and pawns are expendable. Jonathan's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. Slowly, carefully, he peeked inside. There, sitting in a leather chair, sipping a glass of whiskey, was Senator Mitchell Gray. And standing beside him, smirking, was someone Jonathan never expected. Andrew Carter. Jonathan's pulse slowed. Carter, the man who had been helping him. The man who had warned him about Lawson. The man who had been at his side from the beginning. Was standing next to the man who had ordered his death. Jonathan clenched his fists. It had been a setup all along. Then, the floorboard beneath him creaked. Gray looked up. Carter's eyes flicked toward the door. Jonathan knew that look. They knew he was here. Then, before he could react, the lights went out, and gunfire erupted. Gunfire ripped through the dark hallway as Jonathan dove for cover. Bullets shattered the expensive glass doors behind him, sending shards flying in every direction. His instincts took over, muscle memory from years of combat training kicking in. He had been set up. Again, Carter's voice echoed through the estate. Cole, I really hoped you'd be smarter than this. Jonathan clenched his jaw, reloading his weapon behind a marble pillar. That makes two of us. More bullets rained down. Gray's guards were closing in fast, their footsteps thundering across the polished floors. Jonathan had to move now. He sprinted down the corridor, ducking as bullets whizzed past his head. He vaulted over a wooden railing, landing silently on the floor below. He needed to find an exit. Carter's voice came over the intercom system. You really should have walked away, Cole, but you just had to keep digging. Jonathan spotted a doorway leading to the back of the estate. Almost there. Then, a red dot appeared on his chest. Jonathan barely had time to react before the sniper's shot rang out. He twisted mid-step, the bullet grazing his side instead of hitting his heart. Pain flared, but he gritted his teeth and kept moving. No time to stop. He crashed through the door, stumbling into the backyard. A vast, open garden with nowhere to hide. Fountains, statues, neatly trimmed hedges. All useless when you're being hunted. A spotlight snapped on. Jonathan froze. At least a dozen guards stood in formation, weapons raised. And at the top of the stairs, standing smugly with a glass of whiskey still in hand, was Senator Mitchell Gray. The old man smirked. Jonathan Cole, the great Navy SEAL. How disappointing. Jonathan's breathing was steady despite the pain in his side. His mind was already scanning for an escape route. Gray continued, stepping closer. You think you're special? That you're some kind of hero? He scoffed. You're nothing but a tool. A disposable soldier. And now? You're a loose end. Jonathan's fists clenched. You talk too much. Gray chuckled. And you're out of options. He gestured toward the guards. Kill him. Then boom. An explosion rocked the estate. The ground trembled as a fireball erupted from the side of the building. Guards screamed, diving for cover. The shockwave sent Gray stumbling back. Jonathan didn't waste a second. He grabbed a fallen guard's gun and fired. 3 clean shots, taking down the nearest enemies. Then he sprinted toward the chaos, weaving through the smoke. Carter's voice crackled through an earpiece, his earpiece. What the hell was that? A new voice responded. A little insurance policy. Riley. Jonathan smirked. She actually came through. Gunfire erupted again, but now it was coming from the perimeter. Riley and a group of heavily armed allies were storming the estate, taking out Gray's men one by one. Jonathan used the distraction to break away. He spotted Carter in the distance, barking orders into a radio. The traitor. Jonathan raised his weapon. Carter turned and froze. Jonathan stared him down. Give me one reason not to pull this trigger. Carter smirked, despite the gun aimed at his chest. Because I'm the only one who can get you to the broker. Jonathan's finger hovered over the trigger. You're bluffing. Carter took a slow step forward. Am I? Jonathan's eyes narrowed. Then, Gray's voice cut through the air. Carter, kill him. Carter glanced at Gray, then back at Jonathan. And for the first time, Jonathan saw hesitation in his eyes. Gray's guards were regrouping. Time was running out. Riley's voice came through the earpiece again. Cole, we gotta go? Now. Jonathan gritted his teeth. Every part of him wanted to end Carter right here. But if he was telling the truth, he lowered the gun. You're coming with me. Carter smirked. Knew you'd see reason. Jonathan pistol whipped him across the face. Carter groaned, stumbling. All right, maybe I deserve that. Jonathan grabbed him by the collar and dragged him toward the escape route. Riley's team covered them, laying down suppressing fire as they made their way out. Gray shouted after them, his voice filled with fury. You think you can run? You have no idea who you're up against. Jonathan didn't even look back. He already knew. This wasn't just about Gray anymore. This was about taking down the broker. And Jonathan Cole wasn't going to stop until he did. The night was thick with tension as Jonathan dragged Carter into the armored SUV Riley had waiting down the road. The second the doors slammed shut, Riley floored the gas pedal, tires screeching as they tore away from the burning estate. Gunfire cracked behind them. Gray's men were in pursuit. Jonathan shoved Carter into the seat, pressing his forearm against the man's throat. Start talking. Carter coughed, wincing. You might want to focus on not dying first. Jonathan didn't loosen his grip. You think I won't kill you right here? Carter smirked, but his voice was tight with pain. I think you need me alive more than you want to admit. Riley's voice cut through their standoff. Guys, we got bigger problems. Jonathan glanced out the rear window. 3 black SUVs were tailing them, their headlights cutting through the dark. The unmistakable glint of rifle barrels peeked from the windows. Then, the first shot rang out. The back windshield shattered. Jonathan pushed Carter aside, grabbing a rifle from the floor. He rolled the window down and leaned out, steadying his aim. Another shot rang out. Jonathan fired back. The bullet slammed into the lead SUV's tire. The driver swerved, but didn't stop. Bulletproof tires, Riley muttered. Of course. Jonathan ducked back inside, breathing hard. We need to shake them. Riley gritted her teeth. Working on it. She yanked the wheel hard. The SUV veered into an alleyway, knocking over trash cans as they sped through narrow streets. The pursuing cars followed, engines roaring. Jonathan reloaded. Riley, any chance this thing's got toys? Riley smirked. Oh, it's got toys. She flipped a switch on the dashboard. A hidden panel slid open on the back of the SUV. A metal cylinder dropped out, and then exploded. Boom. The blast rocked the alleyway, sending the first car crashing into a wall. The second vehicle swerved wildly, smashing into the remains of the first. The third car, still coming. Jonathan gritted his teeth. He turned to Carter. Last chance. Who is the broker? Carter exhaled slowly. Not here. Jonathan grabbed his shirt. You don't get to stall anymore. Carter held his gaze. I mean it, Cole. If I tell you now, we're all dead. Jonathan stared at him, searching for the lie. For once, he didn't find one. Riley took a hard turn onto the highway, tires screeching. The last SUV stayed right on them. Jonathan made a decision. He climbed out the window. Cole, what the hell are you doing? Riley shouted. Jonathan ignored her, pulling himself onto the roof of their speeding vehicle. Wind howled past his ears as he steadied his stance. The pursuing SUV was gaining. Jonathan raised his rifle, aiming directly at the driver. One shot. The windshield cracked, blood sprayed inside, and the SUV swerved violently. It flipped over, rolling across the highway before bursting into flames. Jonathan climbed back inside. Riley glanced at him through the rearview mirror. You are insane. Jonathan smirked. And she sighed. And I respect it. An hour later, Safe House. The Safe House was an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. Isolated. Secure. Perfect for what needed to happen next. Jonathan shoved Carter into a chair and tied his hands behind his back. Start talking. Carter let out a tired chuckle. You really don't waste time, do you? Jonathan pressed a gun to his forehead. This is me being patient. Carter exhaled. All right. You want the truth. Jonathan didn't respond. He just waited. Carter licked his lips. The broker isn't a person. Riley frowned. Then what is it? Carter looked at her. A system. A machine. A network of the most powerful people in the country. Government officials, military brass, corporate executives, People who control everything from behind the scenes. Jonathan's jaw tightened. And you were part of it. Carter scoffed. You don't join the broker. You serve it, whether you know it or not. Riley crossed her arms. And Gray? Carter sighed. One of the top players. But even he answers to someone. Jonathan narrowed his eyes. Who? Carter hesitated. Jonathan pressed the gun harder against his head. Names. Now. Carter swallowed. There's a name that keeps coming up in the files. Someone higher than Gray. Someone untouchable. Riley leaned in. Who? Carter looked at them both. Then, in a whisper, he said, Secretary Ethan Monroe. Jonathan's blood ran cold. Monroe, the Secretary of Defense. One of the most powerful men in the country. Jonathan stepped back, lowering the gun. If Monroe was part of this, then this was bigger than anything he had ever faced. Riley looked between them. So what now? Jonathan clenched his fists. We go after him. Carter sighed. Cole, listen to me. Monroe isn't like Gray. He's untouchable. He's got the military, the intelligence agencies, the entire government protecting him. Jonathan's eyes were cold. Then we burn it all down. Riley smirked. Now you're speaking my language. Carter let out a humorless laugh. You have no idea what you're getting into. Jonathan leaned in. Neither do they. The next morning, the Pentagon, Washington, D.C. In a massive, windowless office deep within the Pentagon, Secretary Ethan Monroe stood at his desk, staring at the city skyline. A phone buzzed on his desk. He answered. Speak. A voice on the other end, calm, professional. Cole survived. Monroe exhaled through his nose. Of course he did. A pause. The voice continued. He knows about you. Monroe finally turned. His sharp blue eyes were unreadable. Then we handle it. The voice hesitated. What are your orders? Monroe's lips curled into a slow smile. Kill him. Kill everyone who helps him. And this time, make sure it's permanent. Back at the safe house, Jonathan stared at a map of Washington, D.C. Monroe's face was burned into his mind. This was no longer just about survival. This was war. And Jonathan Cole never lost a war. The air inside the safe house was thick with tension. Jonathan stood over the table, his fingers pressing against the map of Washington, D.C. This was it. The final battlefield. Secretary Ethan Monroe wasn't just a corrupt politician. He was the mastermind, the one pulling the strings behind the broker. The man who had tried to have Jonathan killed, more than once. Jonathan wasn't going to let him try again. He glanced at Riley, who was scanning intel on her laptop. How deep is his security? She exhaled. It's the Pentagon, Cole. He's got armed guards, encrypted files, surveillance. Getting anywhere near him is impossible. Carter, still tied to a chair, smirked. Told you. Jonathan ignored him. There's always a way in. Carter scoffed. You don't get it, do you? Monroe's not just protected by men with guns. He's protected by the system. The government. Even if you reach him, what then? You think you can just walk out alive? Jonathan turned to him, his expression unreadable. I don't plan on walking out. Riley's fingers froze over the keyboard. Whoa. Whoa. What? Jonathan stared at the map. We don't just take him down. We expose him. We rip the broker out from the roots. Riley narrowed her eyes. And how exactly do you plan on doing that? Jonathan pointed at the map. Monroe has an emergency bunker beneath the Pentagon. That's where he keeps his off-the-records meetings, his private deals. Riley's eyes widened. How do you know that? Jonathan smirked. Because I built it. Silence. Carter blinked. You what? Jonathan's expression darkened. Years ago, before I was a SEAL, I was part of a classified security task force. Monroe hired us to design an off-the-books bunker, completely hidden from the main government networks. No paper trails, no official records. Riley shook her head. And let me guess, he turned it into his own personal war room? Jonathan nodded. That's where we hid him. Carter chuckled. You're insane. Jonathan's eyes burned with cold determination. That's why I'm still alive. Riley exhaled. All right, say we get in. How do we expose him? Jonathan picked up a USB drive from the table. This has everything we need. Emails, financial records, orders he sent to eliminate people like me. We leak it while we're inside. Once it's out, there's no hiding. Carter snorted. Yeah, there's also no escaping. Jonathan smirked. That's where you come in. Carter frowned. What? Jonathan leaned down. You're going to get us inside. Carter scoffed. You seriously think Monroe won't see me coming? Jonathan nodded. He won't. Because you're going to turn yourself in. Carter's smirk faded. You're out of your damn mind. Jonathan untied his ropes. You want to live? This is your best shot. Carter hesitated. And what if I say no? Jonathan's expression hardened. Then you're dead either way. Carter exhaled, rubbing his wrists. Fine. But if we die, I'm haunting you. Jonathan smirked. Get in line. 12 hours later, the Pentagon. Carter walked through the front doors of the Pentagon, his hands raised in surrender. Within seconds, guards swarmed him, guns drawn. One of them grabbed his arm. Andrew Carter? Carter nodded. I need to speak to Secretary Monroe. It's urgent. The guards exchanged glances, then shoved him forward. Move. They escorted him down the hallways, deeper into the building. Carter kept his face neutral, but his pulse was racing. This had to work. Finally, he was led into a sleek, windowless office. And there, sitting behind a massive mahogany desk, was Ethan Monroe, the Secretary of Defense, the man who had tried to kill Jonathan Cole. Monroe leaned back in his chair, watching Carter with mild amusement. I have to say, I didn't expect to see you again. Carter forced a smirk. Figured I'd rather be on the winning side. Monroe chuckled. Is that so? Carter nodded. Cole's coming for you. He won't stop. Monroe's smile didn't fade. I know. Carter blinked. You what? Monroe gestured behind him. A large screen on the wall flickered to life. Security footage appeared, showing the Pentagon's lower tunnels. And on the screen, Jonathan Cole was already inside. Carter's stomach dropped. How? Monroe took a sip of his drink. You really thought I wouldn't be watching? Then, he snapped his fingers. A dozen guards stormed into the tunnels, weapons raised. Carter's heart pounded. No. Monroe smirked. Checkmate. Meanwhile, the tunnels beneath the Pentagon. Jonathan crouched behind a stack of crates, his silenced pistol in hand. The walls around him were thick concrete, dimly lit by overhead lights. Riley's voice came through his earpiece. Cole, we have a problem. Jonathan reloaded. Yeah, I see that. Ahead of him, guards moved in formation, blocking his path to Monroe's bunker. He had planned for resistance, but not this much. He had to think fast. Jonathan reached into his vest, pulling out a small, round device. He pressed the trigger and tossed it down the hall. The flashbang exploded, filling the tunnel with a blinding white light. The guards shouted in confusion. Jonathan didn't hesitate. He moved. Fast. He grabbed the first guard, snapping his rifle up and knocking him out cold. The second turned, too late. Jonathan struck him with brutal efficiency, sending him crumpling. But there were too many. Gunfire erupted, forcing him to retreat. Riley's voice crackled. Cole, we need a new plan. Jonathan exhaled. There was no other plan. Then his earpiece buzzed. A new voice. Monroe. Mr. Cole, the Secretary of Defense said, his voice calm, amused. You really should have stayed dead. Jonathan pressed against the wall, his grip tightening on his weapon. Monroe continued. You've been impressive, I'll admit. But this game is over. Jonathan's voice was ice. That's what Gray said. Monroe chuckled. And where is he now? Jonathan didn't answer. Monroe sighed. You can't win, Cole. Even if you take me down, the broker doesn't die. Someone else will take my place. Jonathan's jaw clenched. Monroe's voice dropped lower. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to surrender. You're going to kneel, put your hands behind your head, and accept the fact that you've lost. Silence. Then, Jonathan smirked. Surrender? He said. Yeah, that's not really my thing. Then, he pulled the pin on a grenade and threw it. The grenade sailed through the air, bouncing once on the cold concrete floor before landing right in the middle of the advancing guards. For a single heartbeat, there was silence. Then boom. The explosion sent shockwaves through the tunnel, the blast knocking over several guards and filling the space with thick, choking smoke. The walls trembled, dust raining from the ceiling. Jonathan didn't wait. He sprinted through the haze, weaving between the stunned men, moving fast and precise. Every second counted. Gunfire erupted behind him, bullets whizzing past his head. He rolled behind a steel support beam, then fired back. 2 shots, 2 men down. Riley's voice crackled in his earpiece. Cole, what the hell was that? Jonathan ducked behind cover, reloading. That was me not surrendering. Riley groaned. You do realize you're under the Pentagon, right? Blowing things up isn't exactly subtle. Jonathan smirked. Wasn't trying to be. Another burst of gunfire forced him to move. He darted through a side passage, deeper into the bunker. His target was close, Monroe. Time to end this. Meanwhile, Monroe's office. Monroe sat calmly at his desk, watching the security feed as the tunnel filled with smoke and chaos. Carter stood nearby, his hands clenched into fists. You underestimated him. Monroe sipped his whiskey, completely unfazed. Did I? Carter scoffed. He just wiped out half your men. Monroe chuckled. And yet, here I am. Untouched. He turned his sharp gaze to Carter. Cole's good. I'll give him that. But you're forgetting one thing. Carter narrowed his eyes. What? Monroe leaned forward, a smirk playing at his lips. The only way out of this bunker is through me. Back in the tunnels, Jonathan reached the final security door, a massive, reinforced steel gate leading to Monroe's private bunker. A fingerprint scanner blinked beside it. He was out of time. He grabbed a fallen guard's hand and forced it against the scanner. Access denied. Jonathan cursed. Monroe must have locked it down. Riley's voice came through. You need another way in. Jonathan glanced around. Then, he spotted a vent shaft overhead. It was small, tight, but it would work. He climbed up, wedging himself into the shaft. His muscles screamed from the tight fit, but he pushed forward, inch by inch, toward the other side of the door. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he reached a small opening above Monroe's office. He peered down. Monroe was sitting at his desk, perfectly calm. Carter stood near the wall, arms crossed. And surrounding them, 6 armed men. Jonathan smirked. Time for an entrance. Inside Monroe's office, Monroe swirled his whiskey glass, watching the security feed as his men searched the tunnels. He's trapped, one of the guards reported. No way in. Monroe smirked. Good. Then, the ceiling vent crashed down. Jonathan dropped in like a shadow, landing in a crouch. Before anyone could react, he moved, fast. His first shot took down the guard closest to Monroe. The second man swung his rifle. Jonathan twisted, snapping the man's arm, then slammed him into the desk. The other guards opened fire. Jonathan flipped the desk over, using it as cover. Monroe's calm expression finally cracked. Carter ducked behind a cabinet. Damn it, Cole. Jonathan didn't stop moving. He rolled, fired, took out another guard. 3 left. 1 rushed him with a knife. Jonathan sidestepped, grabbed his wrist, and drove the blade into the man's own chest. 2 left. They hesitated. Jonathan didn't. He grabbed a fallen pistol and fired 2 quick shots. The last guards collapsed. Silence. Only 2 men were left standing. Jonathan and Monroe. The final showdown. Monroe straightened his suit, wiping dust from his sleeve. He looked at Jonathan, unimpressed. You've caused quite a mess, he said. Jonathan aimed his gun. It's about to get worse. Monroe smirked. You think killing me will change anything? Jonathan's finger hovered over the trigger. It's a start. Monroe chuckled. Go ahead then. Shoot. But know this, you kill me, and the broker continues. You expose me, and someone worse takes my place. There is no winning this, Cole. Jonathan's jaw clenched. He wanted to pull the trigger. But Monroe was right about one thing. The broker didn't end with him. Jonathan had spent his life eliminating threats. But this was bigger. His mind raced. There was another way. A smarter way. Jonathan lowered his gun. You're right. Monroe's smirk widened. Good. Now, Jonathan suddenly grabbed Monroe's laptop and slammed a USB drive into it. Monroe's eyes widened. What are you doing? Jonathan tapped his earpiece. Riley, you're up. Riley's voice came through. Uploading everything now. Monroe lunged for the laptop. Jonathan punched him across the face, knocking him to the ground. The screen flickered. Files, emails, secret transactions. Everything Monroe had tried to hide was being leaked in real time. To the press. To law enforcement. To the entire world. Monroe's breath hitched. You think this will stop it? Jonathan crouched beside him. I think it's a damn good start. Then, the alarms blared. Riley's voice was urgent. Cole, we gotta go? Every federal agency just got alerted. Jonathan stood. Time to leave. He turned to Carter. You coming? Carter hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, let's move. Jonathan took one last look at Monroe, the man who had tried to kill him, the man who had thought he was untouchable. Now, Monroe was a dead man walking. Jonathan smirked. See you on the news. Then he turned and disappeared into the chaos. 20 minutes later, rooftop escape. Helicopter blades thundered overhead. Jonathan, Riley and Carter sprinted across the Pentagon's rooftop as sirens wailed below. A black helicopter hovered above them, a rope ladder swinging down. Riley grabbed on first. Carter followed. Jonathan turned and saw a fleet of black SUVs pulling up below. Agents poured out, weapons raised. Monroe's voice rang through a megaphone. "Jonathan Cole, surrender now, or we open fire." Jonathan smirked. He grabbed the ladder and disappeared into the night. The next morning, the fallout. News stations exploded with the story. Breaking news. Leaked files expose government corruption at the highest level. Secretary Ethan Monroe under investigation for illegal operations. The broker network crumbles as leaders go into hiding. Jonathan sat in a safe house, watching the chaos unfold on TV. Riley grinned. "We did it." Jonathan didn't smile. He just exhaled, because he knew the truth. Monroe was done, but the fight wasn't over. The broker was still out there. And Jonathan Cole? He was just getting started. Jonathan sat in the dimly lit safe house, his sharp blue eyes locked onto the television screen. The news played on repeat, the headlines flashing across every major network. Ethan Monroe arrested in corruption scandal. Broker network exposed. Mass resignations rock Washington as secret files leak worldwide. Jonathan Cole, hero or fugitive? Riley paced behind him, shaking her head. "We actually did it." Carter, nursing a bruised jaw from the punch Jonathan had given him earlier, scoffed. "Yeah, and now we're the most wanted people in the country." Jonathan didn't respond. He knew Carter was right. The broker wasn't just one man. It wasn't even just Monroe. It was a system, and though they had cracked it wide open, it wasn't gone. Riley sat on the couch, kicking her feet up. "So what now? We find some tropical island and lay low." Carter snorted. "Yeah, because the government totally won't hunt us down." Jonathan stood, stretching his sore muscles. "We don't hide." Carter blinked. "Excuse me." Jonathan turned to face them, his expression unreadable. "They'll expect us to disappear. They'll expect us to run. We don't." Riley frowned. "Then what do we do?" Jonathan exhaled slowly, his mind already moving to the next step. "We finish it." Carter let out a dry laugh. "Finish it? Cole, we just took down one of the most powerful men in the country. The broker network still has people in high places. You can't take them all down." Jonathan's smirk was deadly. "Watch me." Riley exchanged a glance with Carter, then back at Jonathan. "You're serious?" she said. Jonathan grabbed his gear, slinging his weapon over his shoulder. "I didn't come this far just to walk away." Carter sighed. "Of course you didn't." Jonathan turned to Riley. "How much of the network is still active?" She checked her laptop. "Hard to say. Monroe's arrest sent a shockwave through the system, but the top players? They'll go underground." Jonathan's gaze darkened. "Not deep enough." Riley bit her lip, then nodded. "All right, I'm in." Carter groaned. "You people are insane." Jonathan smirked. "And?" Carter sighed heavily, rubbing his face. "Damn it. Fine. But if we get caught, I'm blaming both of you." Jonathan clapped a hand on Carter's shoulder. "If we get caught, we won't be around to argue about it." Carter groaned. "Fantastic." 3 weeks later, somewhere in Europe, the broker network had gone silent. But Jonathan knew that silence didn't mean it was gone. It meant they were hiding, and that meant they were afraid. That was good. Jonathan sat in a quiet cafe in Paris, a black baseball cap pulled low over his face. Riley sat across from him, scanning her phone. She slid it across the table. "Looks like our next lead is in Zurich. Offshore accounts. The money still has to move somewhere." Jonathan took the phone, scanning the information. Carter walked up, setting a fresh coffee on the table. "So, let me get this straight. We took down the biggest players in this conspiracy, and instead of running, we're following the money." Jonathan smirked. "You said it yourself. We can't take them all down." Carter sighed. "Yeah." Jonathan sipped his coffee. "Then we make them take each other down." Riley grinned. "Oh, I like that." Jonathan leaned back in his chair. The broker wasn't dead. Not yet. But it would be. Because Jonathan Cole wasn't done. He was just getting started.